All right, welcome everyone. Today we are hosting a webinar on payer reimbursements and staying proactive through an economic downturn. Today, before we get started, I would like to address a few housekeeping rules. You'll notice that we use a Q&A button that's accessible from the bottom of the Zoom menu bar. The chat box is turned off so that we are able to go through this webinar without as many disruptions as possible. So feel free to submit your questions and feedback in the Q&A section. All right, we will move on to introductions for this webinar. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Ashley Haskins, and I'll let my colleague here introduce herself.
Good day. My name is Megan Linden, Director of Operations for CR BillMax. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Megan. And today, the both of us are going to kind of share in some content that we would love to discuss a little bit more in detail, as it really has a lot of moving parts. And this is all relevant to the payer reimbursements and how this all ties into economic change. So as you'll see here, payers have a lot of topics as far as ways they can negate these processes. So we're going to kind of address a few key things. One obvious thing I want to point out here is that payers are really, feels like sometimes often not in the business of paying. So in today's economy, we can expect them to do more to kind of complicate that process and reimbursing for services that are rendered, finding ways to delay payment, which puts additional stress on organizations and providers to run their business and ultimately provide that quality service. So remember, payer reimbursement concerns are not just reductions in payments. They're tied to updates in the changes of the requirements, maybe for authorizations, medical documentation in the payer's language, aka medical records, ongoing denials and errors on the payer side, and prepayment audits. So the reality is ABA and IDD are long-term services and the long-term cost to the payer as a result. So payers are going to try to find ways to delay or deny payments instead of paying your organization. So we're going to talk about each of these key things on those reimburses, the impacts that they have, how we can approach these key aspects to your business, anticipating potential effects on workers' wages, and how to stay ahead of some of the revenue denials. Before we do, we'd like to take a quick poll to see what this group is experiencing. So we'll go ahead and release a question here in just a moment. We appreciate all of you guys who are giving us feedback here. All right, wonderful. So from what I'm seeing based on this poll, a good chunk of the audience has seen recent changes in your reimbursement as a whole. A smaller chunk have said they really haven't noticed much of a change, and a few of you are just completely unsure of where that currently stands. So this is a really good diverse group that will have a lot of key things that we hope that will pick up on everybody. So we're going to ask one more poll here. Ooh, and the data here is interesting. This is exciting, Megan. All right, so from the results of this one, I'll go ahead and prompt just to kind of have the group think collaboratively, because it's nice to know when you're not the only one in the room. And this poll here really gives us a good idea of how many individuals in these markets have ever really assessed what their fair market evaluation looks like. Are you getting paid adequately? How do you kind of approach these problems? And a good chunk of the room has said never. More than half of that didn't say never said more than 1 to 2 years ago. So we're going to have some exciting topics to talk about here in just a moment. So thank you everyone for contributing to those details. We're going to go ahead and jump to the first topic, which is going over the economy and how payers are assessing the reimbursement. What to look for, what kind of information can you find, and how do you control these pieces of reimbursement? So one of the things I want to share with you is the industry. We have a term called the fair market values. And this isn't just insurance cost of markets. This is the adjustments related in your area. So think about your market, what state, what little niche in your state, Things like the cost of employment, commercial occupancy to run your business. What can you bill for? What are all of the factors related to you being able to bill for that service? That is what's defined in the overscoping category of fair market values. So what we want to do is identify how the payer is managing their part of fair market values and how they receive all the quote unquote usual and customary values, which is another industry term that we've heard from the payer's perspective. So taking a look at these two terms, the data is cumulatively calculated and determined by the payer and what they identify as their fair market value and what they'll base their rates upon. So if all the providers in your little market, in your part of the state, in your little city, invoice a payer for what's only contractually agreed to, maybe on their individual contract or out of network, these providers are kind of doing two things. The individuals who were undercut on an agreement, maybe they didn't know how to negotiate and they received a lower value from that payer, you're going to have that distribution of data. And then you're going to have the group of data from the providers who maybe had really great negotiation skills and they tipped the scale a little bit. So all of this data from a contractual in-network situation or an out-of-network situation is brought into the payer for their determination of what they think is usual and customary. So the industry is allowed to bill for what they determine to you when you go to discuss these rates, those aggregated totals. Now, when we look at from the provider's perspective, well, we know that we should be encouraging these markets and the providers in similar markets to bill for what your cost is of doing services, to kind of take those scales and make them evenly distributed. You want to have other providers in that same market adding data to the payers that reflects what your market is saying, what consumers in your little area need. So next, we want to look for the payers' updates and publications. So now that we've kind of looked at how fair market value data is taken into consideration, the payers' updates and their publications are another way to stay ahead of the economics reimbursement policies. So look for those publications. Payers will send out notifications about their overall policy changes or rate potential reevaluations. They may send them to you via email or provide it on some form of website or a provider manual. So payers are always looking for ways to reduce the amount of money that they pay to providers because this is, in their mind, an incentive for them to keep their business running. They need to find ways to keep their fair market value sustainable for their own economic success. So when we look at those rates and we see reductions, all of these factors I just mentioned before are taken into consideration. They then make policy changes, how we use our codes, how we run our audits, how we increase denials, and take other creative thoughts into how they can make payment a little bit more restrictive. So if you don't get a regular email or mailed publications or information from your payer, it's always wise to make sure you're visiting or signing up for payer communications or visiting the payer's provider website and provider manual for regular updates. And what I mean by regular here is probably quarterly. Most commercial industries will provide quarter updates. If it's a federal payer, maybe monthly, because they change their policies a little bit more frequently. If you don't get regular emails or mailed publications, that's just a good source to make sure you're not waiting for them to communicate to you. They're going to release their information and rely as a provider, you've agreed to maintain current standards. So you kind of have to do the proactive research here on that front. And always look, when possible, go in network. It helps you better understand how to forecast and understand reimbursement because you'll have a set rate. All the services that you render have a standardized value that you can now quantify with your organization's internal understanding of what your usual and customary rates are. So you can better predict, forecast, make decisions with your business growth when you have standard data that does not change. The last piece here, limiting errors, completing proper verification of benefits, asking the right questions, knowing the right details to verify against, making sure your authorization process is solid and that you have that workflow in place, the credentialing of all of your providers, These are all things that can avoid claims from delaying or not being reimbursed or denied altogether for no coverage. So if we can stay proactive in controlling your own reimbursement, these three functions of verifications, authorizations, and credentialing are typically ways that you can start quality pieces without having a claim go out the door and services already rendered before you find out.
Actually, I'd just like to interject there because I think you brought up a really good point regarding economy and the payer reimbursement. Just thinking along the lines of the economy nowadays, right? You brought up a great point of the market value. We all know that the economy is changing right now and how that could potentially impact your business, whether it's a rise in cost of living, rise of gas, rise of all those different pieces. If you update your information and you're billing out more based off of your internal overage charges, that helps tip the scales when the economy changes if you are doing the right contract negotiations at the right time. So just wanted to bring that up because it's, important to look at that now. It's when things are in a better economy versus now. When things are changing, those are what tips those scales one way or the other.
100%. And to your point, the economy constantly has its highs and its lows. So looking at those trends and patterns would be a good indicator. Also, is it now a time to reconsider evaluating all that? So thank you for that, Megan. And moving into the next point, staying proactive. We talked about those overhead costs yearly. That kind of ties exactly into what you just mentioned. Reviewing those contracts and understanding how often you can expect rate changes, looking for patterns, looking for things that you can anticipate in that forecasting model, reviewing staff needs, and then finally just keeping it all together. So let's talk about this for a minute. When you talk about those overhead costs you just outlined on that yearly scope, keeping track of what that means year to year, devising a mechanism that allows you to track those changes. Like you said, this year may be different than last year. What were those factors that influenced that? Having information is important. When you go to contracts and you go to want to be ready to negotiate your rates, you kind of have to keep that data available. You have to have what we call in the industry a charge master, which is a master list of charges that you have as an organization to charge, regardless of who the payer is you're working with. It's your cost of doing business. So that charge master rate and that data, your trending patterns of economic impact, like I said, year to year, how those changes have happened, cost of living increases. Like I said, I used the rent in my example here. When you're having a commercial business, maybe your rent has gone up in your commercial establishment. So taking those increases and including them into your bill charges yearly based on all of these pieces allow you to combine data that you can present in those negotiations as to justifying why you're asking for increases. So reviewing that contract will give you that information. It'll kind of take into consideration how often you reviewed these rates and when they can be increased. Now, it's important to note here that what we're talking about with rate negotiation only applies to commercial policies. Government policies are updated yearly and are published, but these are non-negotiable. These are federally funded payers. So you don't really have negotiation status with any federal resulting payer, but you should question yourself from a commercial standpoint. When was the last time you reviewed your markets? And based on that poll we just did, there's a good fair amount of you who've never really looked at this as far as either feeling like you had the right to ask for more money or compare where your market has changed and how your reimbursement rates have not. But the contract's not really written in stone. It's just an agreement. Agreements can be amended. So review if you have enough or too little staff, kind of to the next piece here. Are you operating with too much staff? Can you cut down on other items like supplies or non-billable time? I'll use an example like maybe you're an organization who takes into consideration people calling out. So you try to anticipate what that coverage needs to look like. So taking close consideration of how you are calculating that coverage and not over calculating so that you're not having too much of a non-billable gap here that you can't actually bill for those services, yet you're trying to keep a business efficient. Stick with other providers in your area. I mentioned in the last slide that all of the providers in your market, whether you're competition, maybe a colleague or a friend that you're in the arena with, you guys all have to work together to make changes in your region. Payers are impacted by the providers who agree to work with the consumers that they service. So each family member pays into an insurance policy. So those insurers are incentivized to have clients have resources, right? So as a group, if we stick together in large volumes or inconsistent practices, we're expressing the same concerns. We're more likely to affect that to the payer and have them listen to what we're saying in our market is an impact. So think about that. It's a large industry, but we're still very much a small niche of people. So use that to an advantage. And last but not least, just one other kind of way to stick together is just making sure that we're incentivizing to have in-network providers. This lowers the cost to the consumer. So payers want to have more representation in the in-network group because they want to have a lesser cost to their consumer. So they're incentivized to increase that list. So as a provider, having fair network rates means the payers have eligible in-network providers to the market. Using that thought, if you choose to leave an in-network market to become out of network as a result of not having fair negotiated values, you now become one less provider to their consumers in the in-network market, lowering the cost to their consumer. So these are all things to kind of put in your arsenal of conversation when you're talking about, am I ready to increase my markets? Am I ready to have a conversation with my payer about these consumer rates? So Megan, I'll go ahead and let you chime in here and take a little bit of an approach from the internal side.
Sounds great. I mean, you brought up some great points regarding how you can overall work with the payers, but how could you work internally to make sure that you're proactive with how to retain your employees, how to keep your employees happy? And let's face it, nowadays, everybody is looking for the next best thing. Where is the grass greener? How can we keep those good employees where in such a niche market that we're in, it's already hard enough to find providers? What can we do to make sure that we're holding them within our organization, but at the same time, not, putting ourselves out of business? So you want to take a proactive approach to workers' wages. You want to take a benefit overview. Look yearly when you're at that open enrollment time. See what your overhead costs are as far as staff benefits, like your health insurance, your dental insurance, your vision insurance. Make sure that what you're providing is stuff and benefits that your current staff is currently using. And are you actually getting the best rates for the plan types that you're providing for your staff? You may want to look at a larger group that can provide better benefits at a lower cost to you and a lower cost to your employees, meaning that they put more money in their pockets instead of having to pay higher benefits out of their paycheck every week, every bi-week, every month, whatever that may be. You want to also review the inflation. What is it doing to your staff? Proactively review how you can continue to ensure that your staff is being paid according to the current wages for their role, as well as the cost of living changes. Right now, we're in an economy, as always, that goes up, it goes down. You never know what's going to happen in the next day. But if you stay ahead of what's going on, you could proactively look at that information to see, where are we spending the most of our money? Is it on wages? Can we reduce wages somewhere? Can we provide different ways of retaining our staff that may not necessarily be compensation? You also want to make sure that your providers are using authorization to the full utilization. We've seen in our industry that a lot of the times organizations are losing out on money because they are approved for a certain amount of authorizations and units and time, but they're not always fully being rendered. You want to work with your team to make sure that they are scheduling appointments based on authorizations, and do not schedule or render service without an authorization. And make sure that you're scheduling with your team to make sure that if authorizations aren't being fully utilized, you're looking at why. Is it constant cancellations from the family? Is it constant cancellations from the provider? Where can you better use the staff to make sure that they're not losing out on hours, they're not losing out on pay, but at the same time that you're fully using the services that you were authorized for to make sure that you're benefiting your organization by getting paid for services rendered. You also want to, like I said, look at ways to retain employees outside of wages. Get employee feedback on what makes them happy and support those requests. Believe it or not, we're back here in the office 3 days a week. And little things like small potlucks that the team participates in, bringing in donuts, a small thank you card goes a long way with employee retention, and it doesn't cost the organization, managers, or anybody a large dollar of money. But those little things actually do go a really long way with keeping people happy, which makes you retain them and can only help your business in the long run. You want to be able to stay ahead of denials, right? Organizations and payers, like we've said, are in the business of not paying. We see it more increased, especially at the start of the year, when, like Ashley said at the beginning of this presentation, that payers are now, because of the economy, they're looking at reducing costs. So what's the best way that they can reduce costs? Not paying providers for the services rendered. How can you stay ahead of that to make sure that you're not falling within that bucket of claim denials, non-payment, delay in payment? You want to make sure that you understand your peer rules and guidelines. Understand which of your providers are eligible to provide services. Make sure they're properly credentialed, that they're linked to contracts to avoid denials. You want to make sure that that's all taken care of. You also want to make sure that you review the proper use of modifiers to ensure compliant billing and avoid unnecessary denials. Believe it or not, in the last couple of months, we've seen quite a few increases in changes regarding the use of specific modifiers. Not staying ahead of that could cause unnecessary denials, holding up your revenue. If you stay ahead of understanding that information, like Ashley said, either by making sure you're signed up for emails for provider payer communications, making sure that you're looking at the correspondence that you get in the mail, reviewing their websites. Don't overlook those pieces of paper that come in the mail and think, oh, I don't need to read this. It's usually filled with a lot of information that could potentially save you from denials in the long run. You also want to make sure that there's no sudden changes that impacts your specialty. Sometimes you'll see changes in ABA codes, sometimes you'll see it in speech, sometimes you'll see it in occupational. They'll group all of that information into one or two publications. So you want to make sure you're reading them thoroughly to make sure that anything in that publication is not missed for any specialties that you're providing services for. You also want to get a better understanding of the timeline of these changes so that you could better understand and plan with your providers and your internal team to make those changes, to make sure that when they are changing, you're staying ahead of it and make any necessary changes within your system, within your processes to stay ahead of it. Because if they make changes as of January 1, and you start that process of changing everything January 1, you're already could be providing services, sending out bills that are incorrect. Also, if you want to make sure that any changes regarding modifiers, codes, fees, you're properly setting them up within your system. Like I just said, if you know that they're starting January 1, you don't want to make those changes January 1. You're already behind. You want to set those up as far in advance as you can so that the date of service that starts off, you're set up for success. You also want to make sure that you communicate with your staff any payer changes that impact them. So they're paying attention when converting timesheets, double checking to make sure authorizations are set up correctly so that they're aware of those changes and not just overlooking something that could be easily corrected or fixed before an error happens. Everybody wants to know, what can you do about held up revenue? Then the first thing you want to do is you want to track denials. Make sure that anything continues to occur within a client or specific payer, you're tracking to make sure, number one, the billing is compliant and you're following the most up-to-date recent guidelines. If you start to see a trend in a specific denial for one payer or one client, you want to look into those payer guidelines to make sure you adjust to any changes that you may have missed to avoid continued denials. If you're finding denials due to errors on the payer levels, you always want to ask for claims interest. I know a lot of people don't ask for that, but if you can prove when you're having claims reprocessed on a constant basis that your claim was 100% correct during that initial submission based off of the payer guidelines, because there was a delay in your payment, you could ask them for interest because it was on the payer's fault. It wasn't on your fault. If you continue to see payer making erroneous denials, work with your network rep to get a project started to save your time, staff on calling on each claim. Again, when you get those reps on the phone, you're not always going to get somebody who knows what they're talking about. Escalate it to a supervisor when you're on the phone. It's the best way to make sure that you're getting the most accurate information. But again, being in network, you have a contract rep for a reason. If the payer continues to give you a problem, they changed guidelines, you weren't 100% aware of them, you could typically get your provider rep on the phone to help with the project. So you're not paying admin staff for constant reprocessing, printing all of these claims, sending corrected claims. Get that information from a supervisor or a provider rep to make sure that you're using the best of your time with your staff for the best outcomes. You want to send reprocessing or reconsiderations with the portal to speed up the process and to also prevent long hold times and waiting on traditional mail to get the documents to the payer. It also, when you send everything through the portal, you're assisting with the cost of having to print, mail out claims. And if we can't say it enough, you want to document. Track any and all information you could get when it comes to claim denials. Proper reference numbers, names, ongoing issues that you're having. So that way, when you do go to a provider rep, you have all of the information already available so that it just speeds up the process even further.
Yeah, Megan, going into RCM and being the experts that we've been in this niche for a while, we can say that changes are scary. And these tips that we're giving and things that are kind of key triggers for you to start thinking about, knowing what to look for, being proactive, most importantly, will help you ride an uncertainty of the economy, what's going in, where we're in our highs and our lows, and how you can best prepare yourself as an organization to kind of ride through those waves.
All great points. So why central reach? You have all of these contract issues, payer reimbursement changes, whether it's guidelines that are changing, them all of a sudden asking for medical records, prepayment denials, prepayment audits, whatever it may be. Central reach puts everything in your hands in one place. Your medical records are in one place, your timesheets, your data, all of your billing information isn't all in one space, which makes it really easy and helpful to track when you do go to these payers to renegotiate fees. You see what you've billed out and what your agreed rates are. It's easily visible and it's easily translated to these payers to prove why you need to renegotiate your rates. Whether it's a change in the economy, whether it's your cost of owning a business has gone up. All of your information is in one area, which makes getting that information over to a payer for any reason all that much easier.
Agreed. So whether you're doing this on your own or you're using a partner like CR BillMax, you can kind of come at this in two different ways. So looking at using a tool and then using an agent as a partner in that process, I can speak on how using an agent to kind of help you collect that data, track the information, bring those details together. One of the things that I personally give advice to groups that are using BillMax services just as a starting point is you've got to start somewhere. You've got to start looking at the data, identifying where you currently stand, and then knowing your tools. But ultimately, once you put those pieces together, take the step, be bold, be confident in your data, and build your case. And whether you're doing that on your own or using BillMax to help you build a stronger case with details maybe you didn't think about. As revenue experts, we'll deep dive into all of those little details to make sure you're pulling in all of the details that you can from your revenue perspective to your market perspective and help support you in that journey.